It started with a game. Something harmless, or so I thought. Emily had always been someone who jumped from hobby to hobby. Painting, baking, yoga. So when she said she was trying out an online game to unwind, I didn't think much of it. Just something fun to relax with, she'd said, laughing as she set up her laptop on the dining table. At first, it was innocent. She'd play for an hour or two in the evenings, tell me about her character, a rogue elf or something, and share funny stories about the people she played with. "There's this guy in my group," she said once, laughing. "He calls himself Shadow Knight 42. Can you imagine? So dramatic." I smiled, amused by how into it she seemed. It was harmless. That's what I told myself. But looking back, I should have paid more attention. I should have noticed when those 1-hour sessions stretched into 3, then 4. I should have questioned the late nights, the whispered conversations, the way she'd close her laptop whenever I walked into the room. But I didn't. I trusted her. I didn't think for a second that something as trivial as a game could become something so much bigger, something that would shatter my world. At first, it really did seem like no big deal. Emily had always been the type to throw herself into whatever interested her, and the game was no different. She'd sit at the dining table with her laptop open, her headphones on, talking to her teammates about raids and strategies like it was the most important thing in the world. "We finally beat that boss last night," she said one morning over breakfast, her face lighting up. "It took us hours, but we did it. Shadow Knight had to revive me twice." "Sounds intense," I said, half listening as I sipped my coffee. "You must really trust this Shadow Knight guy if he's saving you all the time." She laughed. "It's just a game, Luke. Don't be ridiculous." I laughed with her, brushing it off. Why wouldn't I? Emily was happy, and if this was what it took to help her relax, who was I to judge? But as the weeks went on, her enthusiasm turned into obsession. She started spending more and more time playing, staying up late into the night, her face lit by the glow of her screen. "Just one more quest," she'd say when I told her it was time for bed. "I'm almost done." But she never was. Some nights, I'd wake up at 2 or 3 in the morning and find her still at the dining table, her headphones on, whispering into the mic like she didn't want to wake me. I started to feel a twinge of unease, but I brushed it off. Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe this was just her way of de-stressing. Then there were the nights she'd turn her laptop away from me when I walked into the room, quickly closing chat windows or minimizing her screen. I'd ask her about it, and she'd laugh it off. "You wouldn't understand," she'd say. "It's just nerdy game stuff." I wanted to believe her. I really did. But there was something in the way she said it, something in the way she avoided looking at me when she did, that made my stomach twist. I started to pay closer attention, watching for little clues that something wasn't right. And the more I watched, the more I noticed. The way she'd get dressed up just to sit in front of her laptop, the way her phone would buzz with notifications that she'd quickly swipe away, the way she'd laugh at something on her screen, a soft, intimate laugh that didn't feel like it was meant for me. Then there was the name. A username that kept popping up whenever she talked about the game, Shadow Knight 42. At first, it sounded like just another player, someone she teamed up with for quests or battles. But the way she said it, with a hint of a smile and a softness in her voice, made me wonder, who's Shadow Knight 42? I asked one evening, trying to keep my tone casual. She looked up from her laptop, her expression unreadable. "Oh, just a friend," she said, brushing it off. "He's in our guild. He's really good at the game. Do you talk to him a lot?" I pressed, my stomach tightening. She shrugged. "Not really. Just about game stuff." I wanted to believe her, but the unease in my chest wouldn't go away. Something about the way she said it, the way she avoided my gaze, didn't sit right with me. That night, after she'd gone to bed, I opened her laptop. I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding as I stared at the login screen. I didn't want to invade her privacy, but something inside me, some instinct I couldn't ignore, pushed me to look. I found the game still running, her character standing idle in a virtual town square. I clicked on the chat history, my hands shaking as I scrolled through the messages. At first, it was nothing out of the ordinary. Team strategy, game mechanics, the kind of stuff you'd expect. But then I saw his name, Shadow Knight 42, and the messages changed. "You looked beautiful tonight." I can't stop thinking about you. When can we talk again? My stomach dropped as I stared at the screen, the words blurring in my vision. This wasn't just a game. This was something else, something far more dangerous. My mind raced with questions I didn't want to answer. Who was this guy? How long had this been going on? And, most importantly, what the hell was I going to do about it? That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. The words I'd read were like a brand, burning into my mind, refusing to let go. Emily had been hiding something from me, something I couldn't ignore anymore. And now, I had to face it. The morning after I found the messages, I couldn't look at Emily without feeling like my skin was on fire. She sat across from me at the breakfast table, chatting with the kids as if nothing was wrong, her laugh light and carefree. It was the same laugh I'd fallen in love with all those years ago, but now it felt like poison. She looked over at me and smiled, her eyes warm and familiar. For a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined everything, but I hadn't. I'd seen the messages. I knew the truth. "You okay?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. I forced a nod, my hands tightening around my coffee cup. "Yeah, just tired," I muttered, not trusting myself to say anything more. I could feel her eyes on me, but I didn't look up. I couldn't. The guilt she should have felt didn't seem to exist. I wondered if she even realized what she was doing, how deep her betrayal had cut. The day passed in a blur. I couldn't focus on work, couldn't think straight. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her name next to his, their messages playing on a loop in my mind. "You looked beautiful tonight. I wish you were here." I felt like I was unraveling, my chest tight with a mix of anger and helplessness. By the time evening came, I was barely holding myself together. Emily was in the living room, her laptop open on the coffee table, her headphones already in place. The kids were upstairs, getting ready for bed, and I lingered in the hallway, watching her. She looked different tonight. Her hair was down, cascading over her shoulders in soft waves, and she was wearing a top that dipped lower than usual, exposing her collarbone. She leaned forward slightly, adjusting the angle of her laptop. My breath hitched when I saw the faint glow of the screen reflect in her eyes. She was smiling, but not at me. I stepped closer, staying in the shadows, my heart pounding as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. She shifted again, pulling her top down slightly as she adjusted the camera. My stomach churned, a mix of nausea and rage bubbling to the surface as I realized what she was doing. She was showing herself to him. My wife, the woman I thought I knew better than anyone, was baring herself for another man. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone, my thumb hovering over the record button. Part of me felt sick for even considering it, but I needed proof. If I confronted her without it, she'd deny everything. She'd twist the story, make me out to be paranoid. I had to protect myself, to show her exactly what she had become. I hit record, my chest tightening as I watched her laugh softly, her voice barely audible over the hum of her laptop. "You like that?" she asked, her tone light and teasing. My vision blurred with anger as I stared at her. My wife? Acting like this was normal, like it was nothing. I wanted to burst into the room, to throw the laptop across the floor, but I stayed rooted in place, my phone trembling in my hand. I had to be smart about this. I couldn't let my emotions take over. After a few minutes, she leaned back, pulling her top up as if nothing had happened. I ended the recording, my jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. I slipped back into the hallway, my mind racing as I tried to process what I'd just seen. I wanted to scream, to punch something, to let the rage burning inside me out, but I couldn't. Not yet. I needed to keep it together, for the kids, if nothing else. When I heard her coming upstairs, I ducked into the bedroom, pretending to be asleep. She slipped into bed beside me, her movements careful and quiet. I felt her body next to mine, the familiar weight of her presence that had once been comforting. Now, it felt like a lie. The next morning, I couldn't hold it in any longer. She was in the kitchen, sipping her coffee and scrolling through her phone when I walked in. "We need to talk," I said, my voice tight. She looked up, her brow furrowing slightly. "What's wrong?" she asked, setting her mug down. "You tell me," I said, crossing my arms over my chest. "What were you doing on your laptop last night, Emily?" Her face went pale, her eyes widening slightly. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Don't play dumb," I said, pulling out my phone. I opened the video, holding it up so she could see the screen. Her breath hitched as she watched herself, her hands trembling as she reached for the counter to steady herself. "Look," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can explain." "Explain what?" I snapped, my anger boiling over. "That you've been flashing yourself to some guy online? That you've been lying to me for God knows how long?" Tears welled in her eyes as she shook her head. "It's not like that," she said, her voice cracking. "It didn't mean anything." "Didn't mean anything?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You sat there, smiling and laughing, showing yourself to him like it was nothing. And you're telling me it didn't mean anything?" She broke down then, her sobs filling the room as she buried her face in her hands. "I'm sorry," she choked out. "I'm so sorry, Luke. I didn't mean to hurt you." I stared at her, my chest heaving with anger and disgust. "You didn't mean to hurt me?" I said, my voice trembling. "You think this is about me? What about the kids, Emily? What happens when they find out what you've been doing?" She shook her head, her sobs growing louder. "They don't have to know," she said desperately. "We can fix this. Please, Luke. I'll do whatever it takes. Just don't leave me." Her words were like nails on a chalkboard, grating against the last shred of patience I had left. "You think I'm going to just forget about this?" I said, my voice cold. "You think I'm going to pretend like none of this happened? You destroyed us, Emily. You destroyed everything." Her sobs grew louder, but I didn't care. I couldn't care. I turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her behind as I tried to catch my breath. My world had been shattered, and there was no putting it back together. Emily sat at the kitchen table, her face pale, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She hadn't moved from that spot since our confrontation the night before. The weight of her guilt was clear in the way she slumped over, her hands trembling as she clutched her coffee mug like it was the only thing holding her together. I stood by the counter, arms crossed, staring at her in silence. The air between us was thick, the kind of silence that doesn't need words to be heavy. Finally, she looked up at me, her expression raw and vulnerable. "Luke," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's something I need to tell you." I didn't respond, waiting for her to continue. My heart was a storm of anger, betrayal, and confusion, but I kept it buried, forcing myself to stay calm. She took a deep breath, her hands shaking as she set the mug down. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she said, her voice trembling. "When I started playing the game, it was just for fun. It was something to take my mind off things, to escape for a little while. I never thought it would turn into this." "So how did it?" I asked, my voice cold. "How does a game turn into you flashing yourself to some random guy on the internet?" She flinched at my words, tears spilling down her cheeks. "It didn't start that way," she said quickly. "At first, it was just harmless messages, talking about the game, joking around. But then he started, asking for more." "More?" I said, my jaw tightening. "What do you mean, more?" She hesitated, her eyes darting toward the floor. "He started saying things, personal things. He said he could tell I was lonely, that I deserved to feel wanted. At first, I thought he was just being friendly, but then her voice broke, and she buried her face in her hands. Then he said he knew where I lived." My stomach turned, a cold weight settling in my chest. "What?" I said sharply. She nodded, her sobs growing louder. "He said he'd found my address online. He told me if I didn't do what he wanted, he'd send messages to you, to my friends, to everyone. He said he'd ruin my life, Luke." My breath caught in my throat as her words sank in. "And you believed him?" I asked, my voice trembling. "You actually thought he'd follow through?" She looked up at me, her eyes filled with desperation. "I didn't know what to do," she said. "I was scared. I didn't want you to find out. I didn't want to lose everything." I leaned against the counter, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to scream at her, to remind her that she should have come to me instead of giving in to his demands. But another part of me, one I didn't want to acknowledge, felt a flicker of sympathy. She had been manipulated, cornered, and afraid. And as much as I hated what she'd done, I couldn't ignore the fact that she'd been a victim too. Why didn't you tell me? I asked, my voice softer now. Why didn't you come to me the moment he started threatening you? I was ashamed, she whispered. I thought you'd hate me. I thought you'd leave. I ran a hand through my hair, trying to process everything. This wasn't just betrayal. It was something darker, something that had been forced upon her by a man who had preyed on her vulnerability. My anger shifted, no longer directed solely at her, but at the faceless player who had done this to my family. Who is he? I asked, my voice steady. Do you know anything about him? His name, where he's from? She shook her head. I only know his username, ShadowKnight42. That's all he ever told me. I nodded, a plan already forming in my mind. We're going to fix this, I said firmly. But not the way you think. I'm not letting him get away with this. She looked up at me, confusion and fear written all over her face. What do you mean? I mean I'm going to find him, I said, my voice cold with determination. And when I do, he's going to pay for what he's done. I wasn't going to let this ShadowKnight42 get away with it. He thought he could manipulate and blackmail my wife, threaten my family, and walk away without consequences. No, he had picked the wrong person to mess with. That night, as Emily slept upstairs, I sat in the living room, phone in hand, scrolling through my contacts. I knew exactly who I needed to call, Jason Beckett. Back in college, Jason and I had been inseparable. While I went into finance, Jason had taken a different path, joining the police force before becoming a private investigator. He was sharp, relentless, and just the kind of person I needed for this. It had been years since we'd spoken, but I didn't hesitate. I dialed his number, my chest tightening as the phone rang. Look, he answered, his voice familiar but gruffer than I remembered. Long time, no talk. What's going on? I didn't waste time with pleasantries. Jason, I need your help, I said, my voice steady but urgent. It's personal. There was a pause on the other end before he spoke again. All right, he said. Tell me everything. I didn't hold back. I told him about the game, the messages, the blackmail, and the betrayal. As I spoke, my anger boiled to the surface again, but Jason listened quietly, his tone professional but sympathetic. When I finished, he let out a low whistle. That's messed up, he said, but you're in luck. This kind of thing is right in my wheelhouse. If this guy thinks he's anonymous online, he's in for a rude awakening. Everyone leaves a trail. You just have to know where to look. So you can help? I asked, my voice thick with desperation. You can find him? I can, Jason said confidently. It might take some time, but I'll get him. And when I do, we'll make sure he pays for what he's done. Relief washed over me. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had an ally in this nightmare. Over the next few days, Jason got to work. He kept me updated, explaining how he was tracing Shadow Knight's IP address through the game servers, combing through chat logs, and searching for any breadcrumbs that could lead us to his real identity. It was a waiting game, but I trusted Jason to deliver. In the meantime, I tried to keep things together at home. Emily was a shadow of herself, guilt and fear written all over her face. She avoided her laptop entirely, the game that had once brought her joy now a source of shame and regret. We didn't talk much about what had happened. There was nothing left to say until Jason found this man and brought him to justice. Then, one evening, Jason called. I've got him, he said, his voice brimming with triumph. My heart pounded as I listened to him lay out the details. ShadowKnight42's real name was Greg Halverson, a 32-year-old IT specialist living halfway across the country. Jason had tracked him down through a combination of his gaming activity, social media profiles, and some shady forums where he'd posted under the same username. This guy's a piece of work, Jason said. He's got a history of targeting women online, manipulating them, and threatening them. You're not the first family he's tried to destroy. Then why the hell isn't he in jail? I asked, anger bubbling to the surface. Because most people don't fight back, Jason replied. But you're not most people. And now we've got everything we need to take him down. Jason walked me through the plan. He'd gathered enough evidence to prove Greg's blackmail, including chat logs, screenshots of his threats, and records of the payments he'd extorted from other victims. "We'll hand this over to the police," Jason said. "With the evidence we have, there's no way he's walking away from this." The next morning, we met with law enforcement. Jason laid everything out, presenting the evidence in a way that was impossible to refute. The officers listened intently, their expressions growing grimmer as the full extent of Greg's actions came to light. "This guy's been on our radar before," one of them said, "but we've never had enough to pin him down. Until now." Greg was arrested a week later. Watching the news that evening, seeing his face flash across the screen as he was led out of his apartment in handcuffs, I felt a sense of justice I hadn't thought possible. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I could breathe again. The trial moved quickly, thanks to the airtight case Jason had built. The evidence was overwhelming, and Greg's smug demeanor crumbled as witness after witness testified against him. By the time the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, he looked like a broken man. The judge sentenced him to 20 years in prison, a punishment that felt fitting for the destruction he'd caused. When the gavel fell, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. It was over. He was gone. That night, as I sat in the living room with Emily, the weight of the past few weeks finally lifted. She looked at me, her eyes filled with tears, but this time, they weren't tears of guilt. They were tears of relief. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I don't deserve it, but thank you for fighting for me. For us." I nodded, my chest tightening as I looked at her. "You were wrong, Emily," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "But he was worse. And now, he's paying for what he did." She reached for my hand, her fingers trembling as they brushed against mine. For the first time in weeks, I didn't pull away. There was still a long road ahead, still so much to heal from. But for the first time, it felt like we had a chance to rebuild what had been broken. After Greg was sentenced, life finally began to settle. For weeks, I had been running on adrenaline, consumed by anger and determination. But now, standing on the other side of it, I felt the exhaustion hit me like a wave. The fight was over, and for the first time, I could focus on what truly mattered: my family. Emily had changed. She was no longer the confident, playful woman who had once dived headfirst into a gaming world for fun. She carried herself differently now, quieter, more reserved, and always careful around me. The guilt and shame were still etched into her every expression, and while I knew she deserved to feel some of it, I also couldn't ignore the part of me that wanted to let it go. She was trying in her way to make amends, and I couldn't deny that. For better or worse, she was still the woman I'd built my life with. The kids were a welcome distraction from the heaviness that lingered in the air. Their laughter, their stories about school, their endless energy. It reminded me of what I was fighting for. Emily threw herself into being a mother, going out of her way to be present in every moment. She helped with homework, cooked their favorite meals, and spent hours playing with them in the backyard. It was as if she was trying to prove, not just to me but to herself, that she could still be a good mother despite everything. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Emily sat beside me on the couch. She hadn't approached me like this in weeks, always keeping her distance, afraid of crossing a line. But now, she sat close enough that our shoulders touched. "Look," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I know I've said this before, but I need to say it again. I'm so sorry for everything I've done. For the lies, for the pain I caused. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know how much I regret it." I didn't respond immediately, staring at the blank TV screen in front of us. Her words hung in the air, heavy and raw. Finally, I turned to look at her, my chest tightening as I saw the tears in her eyes. "Emily," I began, my voice steady but low, "what you did, it broke me. It broke us. I don't know if we'll ever be the same again. But I also know that holding on to this anger forever won't help anyone. Not me, not you, and definitely not the kids." She nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks as she clung to my every word. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said, her voice shaking. "Whatever you need me to do to make this right, I'll do it. I just want to be the wife and mother you deserve." For a long time, I didn't say anything, the silence stretching between us. Then, Slowly, I reached out and took her hand in mine. It was the first time I'd touched her in weeks, and I felt her gasp at the contact. "I can't forget what happened," I said finally, "but I can try to forgive you. It's not going to be easy, and it's not going to happen overnight, but I'm willing to try, if you are." She broke down completely, her body shaking as she sobbed into her hands. "Thank you," she whispered through her tears. "Thank you for giving me another chance." The days that followed were filled with small but meaningful steps forward. We started talking again, really talking, not just about the kids or the day-to-day logistics of life, but about us, about what had gone wrong and how we could fix it. Emily opened up about how lonely she'd felt, how she'd let her insecurities and boredom push her into a world where she thought she could escape. She admitted that she'd been wrong, that she should have come to me instead of running away from our problems. And I admitted that maybe I'd taken her for granted, assuming she was fine because she never said otherwise. We began seeing a therapist together, someone who helped us navigate the minefield of trust and betrayal we were trying to rebuild. It was hard, harder than I ever imagined. There were moments when I wanted to walk away, when the anger and resentment threatened to consume me. But each time, I thought about the kids, about the life we'd built, and I reminded myself why I was fighting to make it work. Emily, to her credit, did everything she could to prove she was committed to change. She deleted the game, cut ties with everyone associated with it, and devoted herself entirely to our family. She even took on a part-time job at a local nonprofit, something that gave her a sense of purpose and allowed her to contribute to the community. It was a small thing, but it was a step toward rebuilding the life we'd almost lost. Months passed, and slowly, the wounds began to heal. The nightmares that had once plagued me, the images of her betrayal, the sound of her voice as she talked to him, started to fade. They didn't disappear entirely, but they became quieter, easier to manage. I found myself laughing again, smiling again, feeling something close to normalcy. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the kids play in the yard, Emily turned to me, her expression soft and tentative. "Do you think we'll ever be okay again?" she asked quietly. I thought about it for a moment, watching as our youngest chased the dog around the yard, her laughter ringing out like a melody. "I think we already are," I said finally. "It's not perfect, but it's something." She smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes for the first time in months. And for the first time, I believed that we could make it through this. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but we were on the right path, together.